On January 3, 1864, in the grey violence of Carnley Harbor, the schooner Grafton struck rock and began to die. The sound came first, a deep, splintering crack beneath the hull, then the grinding vibration as timber surrendered to stone. Captain Thomas Musgrave did not shout. He did not need to. Every man aboard understood the shift, from danger to finality. Water forced its way through the breached planks in cold, deliberate surges. The pumps could not match it. The anchor would not hold. Wind pressed the vessel sideways against the reef with mechanical persistence. Musgrave made the only command that remained: abandon ship. They worked fast, not frantically. Panic wastes minutes. Minutes were currency. Into the dinghy went what they could seize before the sea reclaimed it: a quadrant, a compass, a chronometer, tools, canvas, firearms, limited ammunition, and what provisions hands could grab without counting. Behind them, Grafton fractured. A ship is more than wood and sail. It is a boundary, shelter, continuity. When it breaks apart, men feel the scale of what surrounds them. 5 sailors watched their world collapse into surf and floating debris, and then turned toward the only alternative available: land. The Auckland Islands did not welcome them. Rain fell sideways. Wind cut through soaked wool and skin. The shoreline offered no beach of golden reprieve, only tangled scrub, steep slopes, and rock that dropped into the Southern Ocean without hesitation. The Furious Fifties did not exaggerate their reputation. Their first night ashore was not strategic. It was survival in its narrowest form. They crouched beneath canvas stretched low against wind, water seeping beneath their boots, trees groaning in darkness above them. No one slept fully. The island did not grow quiet enough to allow it. At dawn, Musgrave gathered them. He did not promise rescue. He did not speculate. He framed their reality with precision. Waiting for a sail that might never pass was not a plan. Building something, anything, was. In that moment, survival shifted from accident to structure. The morning after the wreck, they explored the inlet that had nearly killed them. Carnley Harbor was less a harbor than a wound carved into the southern edge of Auckland Island. Dense scrub clawed at their clothes. The ground shifted from peat to slick rock without warning. Rain moved in and out like a habit the sky could not break, but the island held what mattered. A freshwater stream cut through the brush not far from their landing point. That discovery alone extended their timeline from days to something larger nearby. Seals crowded the shoreline, massive, loud, and unafraid. Food. George Harris proved his value quickly. Seal hunting was not elegant work. It required timing, strength, and proximity to an animal that could crush bone if mishandled. Yet hunger narrows hesitation. Within days, they were butchering and rendering fat. Seal became meat, oil, hide, sinew. Musgrave insisted they build properly. Not a tent, not a temporary lean-to. A cabin capable of resisting winter in a latitude where winter was not theoretical. Using salvaged tools from the wreck and timber from the surrounding forest, they felled trees and hauled logs by hand. Work began immediately and did not pause for comfort. Alexander McLaren organized cutting and hauling. Francois Reynolds examined each salvaged tool and assessed what could be repaired, sharpened, or reconfigured. Henry Forges followed instruction carefully, learning quickly in silence. The structure rose slowly beside the stream. They named it Epigwait, a word Musgrave had once encountered meaning refuge. It was less a poetic gesture than a psychological brace. Naming something implies continuity. Inside, they built sleeping platforms to lift themselves above damp ground. A stone fireplace anchored the room. Seal oil lamps provided light against the long, gray evenings. Dryness became a luxury. Routine followed structure. Musgrave remained captain, but authority shifted into collaboration. Tasks were assigned by skill. Meals were shared. Sundays were observed, not for ceremony alone, but because ritual creates boundaries inside chaos. They kept a calendar. They washed when water allowed it. They spoke disputes aloud rather than letting them harden in silence. These choices were not sentimental. Isolation dissolves men who stop counting days, who stop cleaning themselves, who stop speaking across small grievances. Outside, storms rearranged the coastline. Inside Epigwait, 5 men began manufacturing stability. Survival shifted from immediate crisis to engineered persistence. The seals along the shore were no longer emergency food. They were raw material. Raynal examined each carcass with the detachment of a mechanic studying parts. Fat was rendered carefully for oil. Hides were scraped and stretched. Sinew was dried for binding. Nothing was discarded unless it had been stripped of function. Industry replaced improvisation. Using clay from the shoreline and stone gathered inland, Raynal constructed a crude forge near the cabin. Bellows were fashioned from seal skin stretched across a wooden frame. Valves were cut from salvaged fragments of the Grafton. The apparatus looked fragile, but once heat gathered in the hearth, it held. With heat came transformation. Bent metal fittings were straightened. Broken hinges were hammered into workable shapes. Nails and spikes were forged from scraps that would otherwise have rusted uselessly in the damp air. Tools sharpened meant work improved, and improved work meant time was no longer consumed entirely by basic maintenance. Light was engineered. Shule oil fed small lamps wicked with moss. Smoke vented through a careful aperture in the roof. Clothing was reinforced with tanned hide to resist constant rain. Soap was made by combining rendered fat with caustic ash, restoring some measure of hygiene in a climate that encouraged rot. Musgrave continued his journal. Ink was produced from improvised materials. Writing became discipline. Each entry marked continuity. Dates were not allowed to blur. Winter tightened its grip. Darkness lengthened. Rain fell with monotonous persistence. The wind pressed against the cabin walls like a weight testing weak joints. Depression did not arrive dramatically. It seeped in as a thinning of purpose. A subtle question of whether the routine mattered. They counted it deliberately. Meals were eaten together. Raynal offered informal explanations of mechanical principles. Musgrave read aloud when material allowed. Games were invented from bones and scraps of wood. These diversions were not entertainment. They were structural supports for the mind. Months passed. No ship appeared. The idea of leaving by their own design moved from background thought to central necessity. The decision to build a vessel was not dramatic. It emerged slowly, tested in conversation, weighed against weather patterns and dwindling probability of rescue. They had the dinghy salvaged from the Grafton. As it stood, it was too small for open ocean travel in the Furious Fifties. But Raynal proposed an alteration that bordered on audacity. The hull could be cut, extended, reinforced. A deck could be added. Shelter could be built against breaking seas. It would not be comfortable. It would be possible. Work began with tools. The forge became the center of the project. Every scrap of iron was repurposed. Barrel hoops were straightened and reforged into fasteners. Hinges became brackets. Broken fragments became spikes. Each new tool increased their precision. The dinghy was hauled to a stable stretch of ground near Epigwait. They measured carefully before making the first cut. The hull was extended to approximately 17 feet. A new keel was constructed and fitted. Stress points were reinforced. Seams were packed with a mixture of seal fur, fat, and resin drawn from local trees, worked into the joints until they sealed against water. Progress was slow. Storms interrupted work. Rain swelled timber. One violent downpour flooded the construction site, warping planks and splitting a section of the hull. For a day, the men stood in silence, assessing damage that represented months of effort. McLaren spoke first. They would rebuild the section and improve drainage. No energy was spent on anger. They reinforced the weakened area and resumed. By mid-1865, the vessel stood complete enough to be named. They called her Rescue. Capacity forced the hardest conversation. With provisions for an ocean crossing, the boat could not safely carry 5 men. 3 would sail, 2 would remain. Musgrave would command the crossing. Raynal would go to maintain structural integrity and repair at sea. 4s would complete the minimum number required to manage sail, steer, and bail in heavy weather. McLaren and Harris would stay at Epigwait. The farewell contained no speeches. On July 19, 1865, after 19 months on Auckland Island, Rescue was launched into grey water. The sea waited without comment. The first hours at sea were manageable. Wind filled the sail without violence. The hull answered the swell with measured motion. Musgrave tested the tiller carefully. learning how rescue responded under weight and ballast. Raynal checked seams repeatedly. Fires bailed even when no water seemed present, unwilling to trust appearances. By nightfall, the weather shifted, clouds thickened, wind hardened, swells stacked into steep ridges that lifted the small vessel high before dropping her sharply into troughs of black water. Spray struck like thrown gravel. Every movement required bracing against impact. Sleep became fragments. Musgrave held course by instinct as much as calculation. With cloud cover obscuring celestial navigation, dead reckoning became their primary method. Distance was estimated by time and motion, both distorted by shifting currents and erratic wind. A larger wave struck them broadside on the second night. The mast bent under strain. The hull rolled hard enough to expose deck planking to the open sky. Water poured in. For several seconds, the boat hovered at an angle that suggested finality. Then she righted. The seams held. They bailed continuously through the dark, cold pressed inward, salt-stiffened clothing, hands split at the knuckles. Speech was minimal, reserved for essential commands. Food was rationed carefully, consumed without appetite. Musgrave aimed for Stewart Island, roughly 280 miles distant. Missing that landfall meant open ocean without corrective opportunity. There would be no second island waiting. On the fifth day, the cloud cover thinned. Visibility opened in a narrow break along the horizon. Four saw it first, a shape that did not shift like the weather, a darker edge against gray. Land. Stewart Island rose low but distinct. They adjusted the course cautiously. Coastal waters carried their own hazards. Exhaustion sharpened risk. On July 24, 1865, rescue made landfall. Their crossing had not been theoretical. It was held. Landing did not feel triumphant. It felt unstable. After days in motion, solid ground seemed uncertain beneath their boots. Their clothes were stiff with salt. Their faces are drawn thin by cold and lack of sleep. But they were alive, and that fact overrode discomfort. Local Maori encountered them first. They were given shelter and food. Water that did not taste of wood or salt. Warmth without wind forcing itself through seams. For a short span, the urgency of survival paused. It did not end. Musgrave understood that two men remained on Auckland Island. McLaren and Harris had trusted the plan. They had watched rescue vanish into grey, not knowing whether the crossing would succeed or fail unseen. Musgrave made his way to a European settlement and began arguing for a return voyage. Compassion alone was insufficient. Winter seas deterred captains. The Auckland Islands had a reputation for wrecks and loss. No formal rescue system existed. Any ship that sailed south would risk hull, cargo, and crew. Musgrave persisted. He described the harbor, the supplies left behind, the exact location of Epigwait. He insisted that two men were alive and maintaining a signal. Eventually, a schooner agreed. The Flying Scud would sail. Musgrave insisted on serving as pilot. Raynal, weakened from the crossing, contributed detailed notes on Carnley Harbor's approach and hazards. Precision replaced memory wherever possible. In early September 1865, less than 2 months after rescue reached New Zealand, the Flying Scud turned south. Fog and weather attempted concealment. Musgrave navigated by familiarity. When Carnley Harbor opened before them, he raised a glass and searched the tree line. For a moment, nothing moved. Then two figures emerged, small, running, alive. McLaren and Harris had kept the structure intact. They maintained the cabin, repaired storm damage, continued hunting seals and preserving meat. The forge stood silent without Raynal's direction, but the routine endured. Weeks had passed without sight of rescue. They did not know whether the boat had reached land or been erased by weather. Hope thinned, but did not disappear. When the Flying Scud entered Carnley Harbor, the recognition was immediate. Smoke was rising, arms lifted. Relief did not arrive as a celebration. It arrived as a release. The weight of uncertainty, carried daily, dropped in an instant. All 5 men stood together again on the shore where Grafton had died 19 months earlier. Before departing, Musgrave gathered what mattered: his journal, the tools forged from salvage, evidence of the cabin, the forge, the extended boat. Not souvenirs, records. The crew of the Flying Scud observed Epigwait with disbelief. A functioning shelter, a fireplace, Organized stores, signs of deliberate structure rather than desperation. Survival had not been accidental, it had been engineered. They left the island together. No ceremony marked the departure. The place that had nearly confined them permanently receded without sentiment. The Auckland Islands remained as they were, cold, wet, indifferent. Back in New Zealand, the story traveled faster than the men themselves. Shipwreck, 19 months stranded. A forge built from scrap. A 17-foot boat constructed from wreckage and resolve. A winter crossing through the Furious Fifties. And a captain who returned. But what distinguished the Grafton castaways was not spectacle. It was structured. They had not survived by drifting from crisis to crisis. From the first week ashore, Musgrave imposed order. Work schedules, shared meals, religious observance, cleanliness, journal keeping. Task assigned by skill, not ego. When despair threatened, routine answered. When tools failed, they manufactured new ones. When waiting became indistinguishable from dying, they chose construction over hope. Reynolds' forge altered the equation. Heat allowed metal to be reshaped. Salvaged iron became nails, clamps, hinges. Seal oil became light. Clay became a structure. Even ink was made to preserve records. They refused intellectual decay. They refused moral collapse. And when rescue proved improbable, they redesigned the problem. The dinghy was extended, reinforced, caulked with seal fur and fat. Rigging twisted from sinew and fiber, ballast set, seams tested repeatedly. The boat was small, the ocean was not. 3 men left because capacity demanded it. 2 stayed because loyalty required it. The decision was practical, not heroic. 5 days in open ocean tested the design. Gale force winds, breaking seas, navigation through cloud and exhaustion, a near capsize, constant bailing. The boat held, land appeared, rescue was organized. All 5 men departed the island alive. In later retellings, the achievement is often simplified into endurance. But endurance alone does not build a forge. Endurance alone does not extend a hull. Endurance alone does not navigate 280 miles of hostile ocean in winter. What they demonstrated was discipline applied over time, competence maintained under pressure, shared responsibility sustained in isolation. The Auckland Islands remain unchanged. Rain still falls most days of the year. Wind still drives across Carnley Harbor. Epigwait no longer stands. But for 19 months, on a remote subantarctic shore, 5 men built structure where there was none. Then they built a boat and left.